For 75 years, one alliance has shaped global power, prevented wars, and waged them when needed. Born from Cold War tensions, NATO became the world's most formidable military force. From nuclear standoffs to modern cyber wars, its influence is undeniable. But in a shifting world, does NATO still hold the future? The birth of an alliance. It was April 4th, 1949. In a grand hall in Washington, D.C., 12 nations signed a single document, a treaty that would change the course of world history. The North Atlantic Treaty wasn't just ink on paper, it was a pact of survival, a promise that an attack on one was an attack on all. 75 years later, that promise still echoes across battlefields, conference rooms, and global power struggles. This is the story of NATO, the alliance that reshaped the world. The post-war landscape. The world in 1949 was on edge. The ashes of World War II were still smoldering, and a new rivalry was already taking shape. The Cold War. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had transformed Eastern Europe into an ironclad sphere of influence. Communist regimes, backed by Moscow, rose in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. The West watched in alarm. Would Stalin stop there, or was this the beginning of something far more dangerous? Why NATO was formed. Europe was exhausted, economies were shattered, and military forces were weak. The United States, untouched by war on its soil, emerged as the only power capable of resisting Soviet expansion. The Berlin blockade of 1948 was a wake-up call. When Stalin cut off all land routes to West Berlin, the Western Allies had to scramble to keep the city alive with an airlift. The message was clear. If the West wanted to stand against Soviet power, they needed unity. Thus, NATO was born. The 12 founding nations, led by the US, UK, France, and Canada, crafted a simple yet revolutionary idea: collective defense. Article 5 of the treaty became its cornerstone. An armed attack against one shall be considered an attack against them all. It was a deterrent, a shield against Soviet aggression, and a new kind of military alliance, one that didn't just prepare for war but aimed to prevent it altogether. The Cold War begins. But would NATO's deterrence hold? The answer came quickly. In 1950, North Korea, backed by Soviet and Chinese support, stormed into South Korea. Though not a NATO operation, the Korean War tested the West's resolve. The US led a United Nations coalition to push back against communist expansion, setting the precedent for future NATO interventions. Meanwhile, the Soviets weren't sitting idle. In 1955, they formed the Warsaw Pact, a direct response to NATO pulling Eastern Bloc nations into a military alliance under Soviet command. Europe was now split between two armed camps, each bracing for a conflict that could engulf the world. NATO expands and adapts. As the Cold War intensified, NATO grew stronger. West Germany joined in 1955, a decision that sent Soviet leaders into a rage. NATO forces stationed troops, built bases, and developed nuclear deterrence strategies. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war, proving just how fragile global security had become. Through it all, NATO's existence was both a warning and a reassurance. The alliance stood as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, ensuring that Europe remained divided but not conquered. But the Cold War was far from over. The conflicts were just beginning. Here's the second section of the script, covering NATO's Cold War interventions, its post-Soviet role, and major conflicts, from Cold War to global conflicts. For decades, NATO stood on high alert, staring down Soviet tanks across the Iron Curtain. But as the Cold War raged on, the alliance faced a question. Was deterrence enough? Could NATO prevent conflict without ever firing a shot? The world wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. The Shadow Wars, NATO's covert battles. The Cold War wasn't just fought with armies, it was waged in whispers, espionage, and proxy wars. While NATO never engaged in direct combat with the Soviet Union, its members were deeply involved in the global chessboard of the Cold War. NATO strategists worked behind the scenes, training anti-communist forces, supplying allies, and countering Soviet influence wherever it spread, from Latin America to Africa to the Middle East. Europe, meanwhile, remained the ultimate flashpoint. NATO stationed thousands of troops along the borders, from the Fulda Gap in Germany to the icy Norwegian frontiers. Military exercises simulated full-scale war scenarios, ensuring NATO forces were ready to respond within hours to any Soviet move. Then, in the 1980s, NATO introduced a game-changer, the Pershing II and cruise missile deployments. The move sparked mass protests across Europe, but it sent a clear message to Moscow: NATO would not back down. This brinkmanship, coupled with economic strains, put pressure on the Soviet Union. By the end of the decade, cracks were forming in the Iron Curtain. The fall of the Soviet Union, NATO's identity crisis. Then, in 1989, the world watched in shock as history turned on its head. The Berlin Wall collapsed, the Eastern Bloc unraveled, and in 1991, the Soviet Union, the very force NATO had been built to counter, ceased to exist. Suddenly, NATO faced an identity crisis. With its greatest enemy gone, was the alliance even necessary anymore? Some questioned if NATO had outlived its purpose, but history had other plans. A new role, NATO in the post-Cold War world. The 1990s introduced a new kind of conflict: civil wars, ethnic massacres, and humanitarian crises that traditional armies weren't prepared to handle. NATO had to evolve. Its first real test came in the Balkans. After the breakup of Yugoslavia, ethnic violence erupted in Bosnia and Herzegovina. NATO initially hesitated, but when reports of genocide and mass killings surfaced, the alliance launched Operation Deliberate Force. In 1995, its first ever military intervention, NATO airstrikes targeted Bosnian Serb positions, forcing a peace agreement and proving that the alliance was no longer just a defensive pact. It was now a force for global stability. The 1999 Kosovo War further cemented this role. Serbian forces, led by Slobodan Milosevic, carried out ethnic cleansing against the Albanian population. The world watched in horror. When diplomacy failed, NATO launched Operation Allied Force, a 78-day bombing campaign that ultimately pushed Serbian forces out of Kosovo. It was a bold and controversial move, as NATO acted without UN approval. But for the alliance, it was a moment of transformation. NATO was now an enforcer, not just a deterrent. The War on Terror, NATO's longest conflict. Then came 9/11. For the first time in history, Article 5 was invoked. An attack on the United States became an attack on all. Within weeks, NATO forces were mobilized for their most ambitious mission yet. Afghanistan. Operation Enduring Freedom marked NATO's first war outside Europe. What started as a mission to dismantle the Taliban and hunt Al-Qaeda soon turned into a 2-decade-long counterinsurgency. NATO's presence grew, training Afghan forces and providing security, but the mission became a war of attrition. By 2021, as NATO forces withdrew, the Taliban returned, raising questions about the alliance's longest and most controversial war. NATO had proven it could project power far beyond Europe. But at what cost? As the world entered the 21st century, new threats were emerging and NATO would have to adapt once again. NATO in a fractured world. 75 years after its founding, NATO stands at a crossroads. It has outlived the Cold War, fought in distant lands, and reshaped global security. But today, new threats are testing its very foundation. Can the alliance survive in a world where enemies are no longer as clear-cut? Resurgent Russia, the return of an old rival. For years, NATO shifted focus toward counterterrorism and cyber defense. Then, in 2014, history came full circle. Russia annexed Crimea. Suddenly, the alliance faced the very threat it was created to deter. NATO responded with sanctions, military aid to Ukraine, and a renewed military presence in Eastern Europe. But the real test came in 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. NATO members armed Ukraine but stopped short of direct intervention, wary of sparking a broader war. Still, the alliance proved its unity, expanding to welcome Finland and Sweden, two nations that had remained neutral for decades. China, cyber warfare, and the new battlefield. But Russia isn't NATO's only concern. China's military rise, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and disinformation campaigns have forced NATO to expand its focus. The battlefield is no longer just land, air, and sea, it's the digital world. NATO's latest doctrine emphasizes hybrid warfare, artificial intelligence, and defense against cyber threats. The uncertain future. Yet, NATO's biggest challenge may not come from foreign adversaries. It may come from within. Political divisions among members, debates over defense spending, and shifting global alliances threaten to weaken the alliance from the inside. 75 years after its founding, NATO remains the world's most powerful military alliance. But as the world changes, one question remains: can it adapt once again? NATO's legacy is undeniable, but its future, that's the real question. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's greatest alliance, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more on History on a Thread.